8 million Ford vehicles. And until recently, I never talked about what happened in the meetings before that decision was final, not because I was legally prevented from doing it, not because I signed something that stopped me, but because when you spend years inside a system, you start to believe the system's explanations. You start to repeat them. And somewhere along the way, you stop asking whether the person who owns the car knows what you know. I'm done with that. What I'm going to walk you through today is the actual process behind how that viscosity spec got approved, what the engineers raised before it was finalized, and what the data started showing afterward. 8 million engines right now. Some of this is going to change what you do this weekend. To understand why any of this matters, you need to know how an oil specification actually gets approved, because it's not an engineer sitting in a room deciding what's best for the engine. That's not how it works, not even close. The process involves multiple departments, and they do not have the same goals. You've got powertrain engineering, which cares about engine longevity and warranty claims. You've got regulatory compliance, which is watching CAFE fuel economy standards like a hawk. You've got finance, which is modeling warranty cost exposure across hundreds of thousands of units. And then you've got product planning, which is making commitments to fleet buyers and government regulators based on fuel economy numbers that haven't been achieved yet. These groups all sit around a table, and the oil viscosity spec is one of the variables they're adjusting to make the numbers work. Not the only variable, but a meaningful one. Here's something most people outside that process don't fully appreciate. A single change in oil viscosity, moving from 5W-30 to 0W-20, can measurably improve fuel economy. On a dynamometer test, we're talking fractions of a percent per vehicle. But when you multiply fractions of a percent across millions of vehicles across a model year, those fractions become real CAFE credit numbers. And CAFE credits are worth money, serious money, in the form of avoided fines and regulatory compliance offsets. The figure that was being discussed internally when this spec was being locked in was roughly $400 million in compliance value across the affected model years. That context matters for everything that comes next. Now, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because I'm not here to claim there was some conspiracy. The engineers in those rooms were not quiet. There were documented concerns raised, not by one person, by several. And the objections were specific, not vague. The primary concern centered on bearing clearances. Here's what that means in plain terms. Every moving part inside your engine has a small gap between it and the surface it rotates against. That gap is intentional. It's where the oil film lives. The oil film is what keeps metal from touching metal. When oil viscosity decreases, when you go thinner, that film gets thinner too. Zero had bearing clearances that were specified during an era when 5W-30 was the assumed lubricant. The concern wasn't that 0W-20 couldn't work, it was whether 0W-20 could maintain an adequate film thickness under sustained high temperature, high load operation. The kind of operation you see in towing, performance driving, or operating in ambient temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The engineering team had data suggesting that under those specific conditions, film thickness could drop to a level that accelerated bearing wear at a rate faster than the warranty modeling accounted for. That concern was heard. It was documented in internal review minutes. And then it was answered, not dismissed, but answered with a set of conditions. The spec would be approved. The drain interval would be set conservatively, and the owner's manual guidance would include language about severe duty operation. But here's where it gets interesting. That severe duty language ended up in a section of the manual that most owners never read. The prominent headline recommendation, what people actually see at the oil change shop, what gets entered into service systems, was 0W-20, full stop. The nuance got buried. So let's talk about what 0W-20 is actually doing inside one of these engines, because understanding the physics here is what makes everything else land. Think of motor oil viscosity like the difference between water and honey. Water flows instantly, gets everywhere fast, but doesn't coat surfaces the way a thicker liquid does. Honey moves slowly, but it clings. It builds a layer. In an engine, what you want is something in between. Thin enough to flow quickly on cold starts, thick enough to maintain a film when temperatures climb and metal is moving fast. Kinematic viscosity is the technical measure for this, and it changes with temperature. When your engine is cold, 0W-20 and 5W-30 behave similarly. That 0W and 5W, the W stands for winter, those ratings describe cold flow behavior. Where they diverge is at operating temperature. The 20 versus the 30 describes how thick the oil remains when it's hot. A 20 weight oil at 100 degrees Celsius is measurably thinner than a 30 weight at the same temperature. 0. Echo boost. This is a turbocharged direct injection 4-cylinder that runs at very high specific output, a lot of power for its displacement. The turbocharger shaft spins at up to 200,000 RPM. The bearings supporting that shaft are lubricated entirely by engine oil. When you shut the engine off, that oil drains back down. When the turbo is still spinning, which it does for several minutes after shutdown, it's coasting on residual oil film. In a 0W-30 environment, that residual film is thicker. It clings longer. In a 0W-20 environment, it's thinner. And on a hot shutdown after hard driving, you can get accelerated wear on those turbo bearings over time. The effect isn't immediate and dramatic. It's cumulative. It's the kind of thing that shows up at 80,000 miles instead of 40,000. Zero is a different animal, naturally aspirated, high-revving, wide main-bearing journals, and the concern there is slightly different. Under sustained high RPM use, the oil pump has to maintain pressure across those wider journals. Thinner oil at temperature means the pump is working harder to maintain the same film thickness. Ford engineers were looking at oil pressure drop data under track conditions and asking whether the spec created unacceptable risk in performance applications. Here's the thing, and this is what pushed me to finally talk about this. The data that came back from third-party oil analysis labs, specifically Blackstone Labs, started showing up in enthusiast forums within 3 to 4 years of these engines hitting the road. Used oil samples from EcoBoost vehicles running 0W-20 were coming back with elevated iron and copper wear metals at intervals that were within the factory-specified drain schedule. Not catastrophically elevated, but statistically higher than comparable samples from vehicles running 5W-30 in equivalent use cases. The more important timeline is what happened with technical service bulletins. TSBs are issued by manufacturers to dealerships. They're not recalls, they're service guidance. They don't always make it to the public in a clear way. 5 EcoBoost was issued, then revised. 0 under certain operating conditions were filed. And the pattern of those TSBs, their language, their timing, is consistent with what you'd expect if the engineering concerns raised before spec approval were being validated in the field. None of this was hidden in the sense of being actively concealed. It's all public information if you know where to look, but it's also not what shows up. On the oil change reminder sticker your dealer puts on your windshield, then there's the European manual discrepancy. Pull up the specification sheet for the Ford EcoBoost engine as sold in several European markets. You will find, in the official manufacturer documentation, a recommendation for 5W-30 as the primary viscosity grade for ambient temperatures above freezing. The same engine architecture, a different spec. Ford's official explanation, when this has been raised, relates to different regulatory and operating environments. That's true. European driving patterns, fuel quality, and testing regimens are different from American ones. But it's also true that 5W-30 is more protective under the high load conditions described earlier. And it's worth asking, if the operating environment alone explained the difference, why do American performance Ford owners who switch to 5W-30 consistently report quieter valve trains, better oil pressure readings at temperature, and lower wear metals in their used oil analysis? That question doesn't have a clean official answer. So, what does this actually mean for you? If you're driving one of these vehicles today and you've been running 0W-20 since you bought it, here's the honest answer. It depends heavily on how you use the vehicle, where you live, and how many miles are on it. If you're driving a naturally aspirated Ford, a non-turbo engine, and you're doing mostly highway miles in a moderate climate, the factory 0W-20 spec is likely fine. These engines have different engineering margins than the boosted versions, and the thin oil risk profile is lower. Stick to the factory interval, maybe pull a Blackstone sample at your next change, and you'll have actual data about your specific engine. 3. And you're in a hot climate, meaning regular ambient temperatures above 85 degrees, consider moving to a high-quality, full synthetic 5W-30 that meets the Ford WSS M2C946B1 specification. You're not voiding your warranty by using a spec-compliant oil in a heavier viscosity grade, as long as the oil meets Ford's own listed specifications. Check your owner's manual appendix for the spec code, not just the viscosity number. If you have over 80,000 miles on a turbocharged EcoBoost and you've been running 0W-20 on factory intervals, this is the most important group. At minimum, cut your drain interval. Go to 5,000 miles maximum if you're running 0W-20, or move to 5W-30 at 7,500. Pull a used oil sample at your next change. Blackstone Labs charges about $30 and gives you a full wear metals breakdown. That data will tell you more about your specific engine than anything I can say in a general video. If you're in a performance application, tracking a Mustang GT, towing near capacity with an F-150, or running your EcoBoost hard regularly, 5W-30 full synthetic is not a maybe. It's the right call. The engineering concerns that were raised before this spec was approved were specifically about high load, high temperature, sustained operation. That is exactly what performance and towing represent. Before you change anything, there are 3 physical things you can check right now. Pull your dipstick after the engine has been running for a few minutes, and then sitting for 10. Look at the oil on the dipstick carefully. If it's dark brown to black, that's not necessarily alarming. Modern detergent oils hold combustion byproducts in suspension, which darkens the oil. That's what they're designed to do. But if the oil looks thin, almost watery when you wipe it on a white paper towel, or if it smells burnt and sharp rather than just oily, those are flags. Second, on cold startup, listen for more than 2 or 3 seconds of lifter tick before the engine quiets down. Some tick on cold start is normal. But if it's taking 4, 5, 6 seconds to go quiet, your oil isn't reaching the valve train fast enough. That can be a viscosity issue, a drainback valve issue, or a consumption issue. Third, check your oil level at every other fuel fill-up. 0 variants have documented tendencies toward oil consumption. If you're adding a quart every 3,000 to 4,000 miles, you're running thinner and lower than the spec assumes. That changes your risk profile significantly. I've sat on parts of this for a long time. What finally pushed me to put it out was watching the same conversation play out with a new generation of engines. Thinner specs, longer intervals, higher output. And knowing that the people most affected are the ones who trust their dealer, follow the sticker on the windshield, and never hear the part of the story that happened in the engineering review. You deserve to know this. You still do. If you've got a different experience, if you've been running 0W-20 in a high mileage EcoBoost with clean Blackstone results and no complaints, I genuinely want to hear it in the comments. Data beats narrative every time, and your real-world experience adds to the picture. If this made you rethink something, or if you know someone running one of these engines who's never thought about this, send it to them. And subscribe if you want to see the follow-up. Because the oil consumption side of this story has its own chapter, and it goes places that will surprise you,